ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me. Okay. The next presentation is by Gina. I don't want to venture into your last name.
Boccuzzi.
Oh, Boccuzzi. Oh, okay. And the name of the presentation is Applying Agile Methodology to Statistical Programming.
My name is Gina. I'm a statistical programmer at PROMETRIKA. I'm based out of Cambridge, and I study computer science at Wentworth in Boston, and I've been using it for about 4 years. So I'm always trying to bring my computer science background into my statistical programming. My presentation is Applying Agile Methodology to Statistical Programming. So the goal of this presentation is to provide everyone with the tools afforded by Agile. It doesn't have to be a full conversion to an Agile environment. We can kind of cherry pick some of the tools that are offered by it. Waterfall is often the default project management style in a CRO, and Agile is more commonly used in software engineering. So it may not always seem like the obvious fit for every situation, but the tools used in it are helpful and easy to scale up and implement on your own. So Agile can seem really daunting and time-consuming, but it doesn't need to be. I'm going to break down the big ideas into smaller concepts that you can easily try out. When you're studying computer science, there's a lot of time spent teaching the benefits of Agile, especially in software engineering courses. So even though I'm not in software engineering anymore, I didn't want to leave that knowledge behind. My first internship was with a software company that had fully converted to an Agile environment, and they spent a lot of time teaching us about the benefits because they had such great results with time management and pacing their projects, and they had great results. So we learned a lot about it, and just because I'm not in that field anymore, I didn't want to leave that knowledge behind. So I'm going to be using Waterfall as my juxtaposition to Agile, and I'll talk about it a little bit more. It's a linear style of project management. There's nothing wrong with it. It's usually the default. I'm not trying to talk bad about Waterfall, but there are some problems that will regularly occur with it. The biggest one is you're chasing due dates because everything's leading into the next. You're always running to catch the next due date as soon as you meet one. So you aren't able to set a proper pace because you're always running to put one fire out after the next. This can also create periods of lull and hyperactivity because you aren't pacing yourself properly. And so much of the review process occurs at the end of a project right before the delivery. So all of the time to account for changes is left until the end. Agile focuses on work and review on an ongoing basis so that changes can be addressed earlier and to diffuse the burden of these changes on the team over the entire duration of the project rather than just during the deliverable period. Making a full conversion may not make sense everywhere, but you can use these tools to help mitigate these challenges and increase your productivity. So what is Agile? Agile was created by software engineers in 2001 on a ski retreat in Utah. If you don't know, you have Silicon Valley. Utah is the Silicon Slopes. They were looking to improve their practices and find a way to create high quality, regularly occurring deliverables to give their customers while keeping a healthy workload. They created 4 principles, and that is all Agile is. At the end of the day, these 4 principles are Agile, period, the end. Everything else is just extra. And it's ways that people have derived to implement these principles. So these principles are individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan. They then specified that both elements in each principle are important, but that is, while there is value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. Some of these are a little bit more geared towards software engineering, but if you think about each one, there is value for us too. And you can really boil it down to collaboration, deliverables, communication, and adapting to change. Anything that tries to follow these principles is inherently Agile. And I'm going to keep using the term Agile to reduce confusion, but there's a ton of different flavors of Agile. The most close to the one that I'm discussing is called Scrum, but there are a lot of different styles out there. So now look at how Agile is implemented. It's a more cyclical style of project management Tasks are completed and reviewed on an ongoing basis through the entire duration of the project. Typically, there's a less firm final end date with a focus on 2-week work cycles. And this can seem impractical, especially if you have external client deadlines, but there's still so many tools developed with Agile in mind to optimize this daily workflow that can be easily implemented and can stand alone. So I've already mentioned Waterfall, and I'm going to discuss it more. It's the typical alternative, and it's what the default often is. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just a linear style of project management. The project moves in dependent steps, going from one to the next upon completion of the prior step. There's a hard start and stop date and less flexibility when changes arise. And these changes can be really time intensive. So this is like a really common timeline. You write your SCTM spec, you do your programming, your Atom spec, your Atom programming, TLX, and then the biostat review, and each task begins after the completion of the prior. So if we're trying to run our project in Agile, we would rework the timeline to be more cyclical, and this won't be a perfect fit for every project. If your deliverables match the previous diagram, with all your SCTM domains due, then at a later date your atoms, you're gonna have a tougher time implementing this element, but there's still other tools. But if you just have one large final deliverable, you can approach it a little more like this. So you'd work in cyclical steps, reviewing as it goes on. So for this, it's a little hard to read, but you would complete your SCTM programming and then work in different cycles. So I did subject level programming, you do ADSL, the dependent tables, your disposition, your demographics, then have the Atom and the tables reviewed by your biostats, and then move on to maybe the adverse events, ADAE, the dependent tables, and follow that with the lab tables. And it's constantly being reviewed as you're going, rather than completing all of this work and getting to the end to be reviewed. So how can we leverage Agile in our daily work? Looking at these breakdowns in the context of my own CRO work environment, Waterfall still makes sense as the overarching project management style because we have external clients and deadlines. But there's still room for improvement. Just because we can't be 100% Agile doesn't mean that we can't use it to our advantage. So I'm gonna break down some smaller practices that we can implement. So this one is daily stand-up. It's a brief meeting every day. This is one of my favorites because it's super easy to implement. It's about 15 minutes and everyone working on a specific project at the time joins the meeting. You go round robin, everyone has to speak, and if you're working on multiple projects, you would have multiple of these meetings daily with each team that you're working with. And the main focuses are just to discuss what you're doing. What did I do yesterday? What's my goal for today? What problems am I encountering? Where am I getting stuck? Holding each other accountable for what you're saying you're accomplishing, and providing that support for each other is really critical. You're able to hear back tomorrow about what your teammates were able to get done. You're able to discuss your schedules, your priorities, and make more dynamic changes because you're in constant communication. Daily can seem like a lot, so starting with 2 or 3 days a week is a good way to ease into it. An example of how this could work, if I'm working on project A and B and I'm falling behind on my project A work because B is taking more of my time, I can discuss that with my team and we can figure out a way to reallocate time, figure out how to move forward so that I'm not straining myself more than needed if other people can help me with the workload. When the communication is occurring daily, the resources are allocated much more efficiently and it takes the strain off everyone else on the team as well. And this is one that we naturally slip into at PROMETRIKA. When we have an upcoming critical deliverable, the programmers will just slip into setting these daily meetings. So it's something that it's really easy to add into your plan. So next is sprint planning and retrospective. So this is a really involved item, but I'm gonna try and make it as simple as I can. So a sprint is 2 weeks, give or take a week, and it's just a period of work. It's just that time length. And a retrospective is the meeting that occurs at the end of the sprint. So in the retrospective, you and the team are taking time to look back at what you were able to accomplish during the prior sprint and plan out what you want to accomplish over the next 2 weeks. You're also focusing on the backlog of work remaining until the end of the project. Daily stand-up does cover some of this, evaluating your pace, keeping an eye on the backlog, but when you're looking at it on a day-to-day level, it's harder to see the big picture and see how you're keeping up with the pace for the whole project. It also allows programmers to evaluate the complexity of outputs and how much they can handle in a week. Was I able to finish everything I took on? Did I complete all of my tasks? Does the study need more programmers? You're able to adjust as you're going through the project and make more dynamic changes to bring programmers on, or maybe take programmers off if you guys are going through it quicker. And by setting these small timelines, the team is able to stay on top of the schedule during the entire project. It's also a really great way to learn more about yourself as a programmer, because you're constantly evaluating your own workload and what you can accomplish in a set amount of time. There's a lot of tools out there to implement sprints. Jira is the most common, especially if you know any software engineers, they probably use Jira. It can be really involved, but on a high level, it's just a point system. Each task is entered that you need on the project and assigned a point value. The higher the point value, the more complex. I think the scales are like 1 to 10, and then as a programmer, you set the value for yourself that you can accomplish in a week, something like 10 to 20, and you take on these tasks. There's the number of points that we need to complete per week to finish the project in time. So if you look at the image, there's a little number in the bottom of each square that has the point values, and the work is broken down for the user of the tasks that they've taken on to do, tasks that they're in progress on, the tasks that are in review, that could be QC or a biostat review, and the tasks that have been completed. For simplicity, if you're starting out, you could just extend your daily stand-up once every 2 weeks to be your retrospective, to try and talk at more length about what you guys have been doing over the last 2 weeks. Post-mortem, this literally means after death. This is what you do after all work has been completed. It can be left up to interpretation a little. You could do it on a daily basis, or just at the end of, I'm sorry, not on a daily basis, on a deliverable basis, or at the end of a project when all work has been completed. This involves the entire team, not just your daily team. So your daily stand-up is the programmers that you're working directly with. This could involve anyone that's been involved over the course of the entire project, and you're gonna work cross-departmentally for this. It doesn't occur super often in software engineering, but in a CRO, because we have a decent number of projects that are being completed as deliverables are being sent, they could happen more often. And the purpose is to discuss all the successes and the failures. It should also result in action items, concrete steps that team members can take to avoid making the same mistakes, to avoid if we're falling behind, if we're we have not enough programmers. You need to have action items leaving this meeting. So for example, if we thought 2 programmers could get all the SDTM done in 2 sprints, then and they couldn't, then we would evaluate what we needed to do to avoid that from happening. If they aren't able to assess their own workload correctly, or if their complexity was different than we had first thought. And then the last one is cyclical approach. So this is the hardest to implement because there is no easy way. It's a mindset rather than a specific practice. It focuses on working in phases rather than step by step. So the ultimate goal is just to distribute the changes and the extra time involved in correcting them over the entire duration of the project, rather than saving them all up till the end and creating a hectic deliverable. And so the conclusions. Agile is not a perfect fit everywhere. A lot of the practices I laid out won't work for everyone, but the tools go back to the core principles. If you're looking to lead your project with collaboration, communication, deliverables, and adaptability, then you are Agile, and these tools should help you with that. Agile is a buzzword, it's thrown around a lot, and it can seem really intimidating and like it's meant for software companies with different project structures and different types of work, but that's not true. The tools I mentioned today, daily stand-up, sprint planning, retrospective, post-mortem, cyclical timelines, these are all easy to implement, and there's many, many more out there. Again, these are kind of the Scrum style, but there's other tools that are available. So they all require some time investment to begin with them, which can also be a little intimidating, but they ultimately are going to save more time than they take. So all these tools yield benefits, so the next time you're leading a study, think about trying one out. Any questions?
If you have questions, maybe you want to use the mic. So.
Hi, thanks Gina, that was really helpful. In the context of IT developing a tool for the business to use, where you have programmers doing the user acceptance testing, do they do the user acceptance testing within the 2-week sprints?
So you just are breaking up any amount of work. So like for the way that I am using it, like I'm not sure what you mean by like the IT teams, like where I'm looking at it from a perspective of I have 50 tables over the course of this, and so I would say I can accomplish these 10 over the next 2 weeks.
Maybe I was more talking about your previous experience from the engineering side where tools are developed for the business, like IT develops tools for the business and the business has to test those tools. And they're using the Agile methodology, which you need the business to actually test the tools.
Yeah.
So do they do that within the 2-week sprint?
Yep, and so that's the feedback. The part of it, that's the review. Like we would have a biostat review, would kind of be the equivalent. But it's always about, they refer to it in Agile as the customer. You're always collaborating with the customer and keeping the customer's interests. And when you're doing Waterfall and you get to the end and you give the customer what they told you they wanted, you're left having to make all of these changes. If you're working in an Agile environment and you're constantly giving them small deliverables, you're able to constantly be changing what you're planning to give them rather than getting to the end and this isn't what we wanted, where on an ongoing basis, so they are reviewing it. That would be the customer. The business is the customer.
Thank you so much for the presentation. So I have 2 questions. Okay. I have actually worked on Agile in the Agile environment, and I experienced 2 problems. Number 1, I found it very difficult to connect a project when you have multiple programmers spread around multiple projects. I think it's easier to do when you have a programmer assign 100% to the project. That's probably might work, but in my case, it really wasn't what happened, and I found it very difficult. Even with meetings, especially when you have programmers spread out across.
Yeah, and you can have multiple meetings.
So it was very difficult. We certainly have to shift people around. So I'm curious how you
yeah, I mean, I like it, especially even when I am on different projects, because I'm able to keep that communication open. If I'm working on a project and you're working on a project, and we're working on another one together, I'm able to tell you that, you know, I'm working on project A, it's taking all of my time, do you have any availability? We're in that constant communication. So I like using these tools when programmers are spread out across different projects, because that's where I find I get into trouble, is if, you know, I'm not talking to you and I'm not finding out, you know, actually the timeline on this is more relaxed, focus on the other thing, we don't need you right now, or I've finished my work, I can take it on. So I think it's most critical when programmers are spread out across different projects.
Second question. So you mentioned that it may be difficult to do a project when you have external deadlines, right? The thing is, I think in United clinical trials, all projects have external deadlines.
Right, yeah. So I was more just doing it as the juxtaposition to software engineering, because that's where this is most typically applied. In software engineering, your deadlines are more internal. The business is the business where you're working, the customer. So it can be different when you have that was all I was saying, is it's just a little different when you're trying to apply it, because it's typically applied to software engineering where the deadlines are more flexible. So that's why you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt when you're applying it here.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
How long are these daily meetings?
15 minutes less. So the goal is that everyone has to talk. These are like the easiest to implement. Like you just send it out to your team. Doesn't have to be daily. 2 or 3 times a week is a good place to start. But yeah, just super short. But everyone has to say something. You can't just listen. You have to be forthcoming with what you're doing and your intentions for the day and the week.
I'm interested in the communication concept and the default over for documentation, especially in a regulatory environment.
Right. Again, like that's part of where I have my comp sci background, and it is more of a software engineering thing, but that's why I want to just break it down that it's not just for software engineering, even though, and I mentioned that on the slide with the principles, even though some of it doesn't seem quite as applicable, there's still just tools that you're able to use, even if it's, we probably wouldn't put the focus on communication over documentation. And that's also why they say both are important, we just value communication more. That may not be true everywhere, but both are important. And ideally you have both, but it's kind of a when push comes to shove, especially in a software engineering world, you would pick communication.
Do you find that there are any tools that you can use to record the communication where people could put updates in a sort of service or platform? I know that some people use Jira. Or
Yep, yeah, I don't know if you came in late, so
I did come in late.
I had a slide on Jira. Yeah, so Jira is the best one. Jira is the most common, maybe it's not the best, but it's the most common, and that's where you would log the values of the tasks you're doing and give feedback, and it is able to move and everybody can see the tasks that are out there.
Speaking of Jira, do you have, well, this is more about scoping, I guess, but in your experience, how do you find it effective to kind of scope tasks? Like, do you try to scope for multiple sprints, like ahead of time for the whole project, or?
Right, so I used Jira when I worked on an IT team. We don't use it currently. At the start of the project, you kind of scope the whole project. I mean, it's kind of on an ongoing basis. In a CRO environment where you know everything you're delivering, you could scope the entire project and all of the tables and stuff. So you do set the values for everything. Then you do work in the 2-week periods of what you're going to be taking on. So I don't plan out all 2 weeks for the entire course. You just do 2 weeks at a time, and you make adjustments if we're not moving through it quick enough. You're able to adjust what you're taking on or bring on more programmers. So you don't plan out all of the sprints for the entire course, but you do set the values of all the work that you have.
Okay.
Yeah, if you're working for a sponsor company and you're outsourcing, do the companies you're outsourcing to have to be using Agile technology, or can you, as a sponsor, be within that Agile environment and they're doing their own thing, but they're kind of, you know.
So there was a talk last year, that was what inspired me to talk about it. There was a talk last year that I believe it was from a sponsor perspective that they had made a full conversion to Agile. And I just felt like it was very intimidating. But when you're on the sponsor side, I think they have more leverage to do that because they have more control over the deadlines and stuff like that. Where in the CRO, you're more beholden to what they're giving you. So that was what inspired me, but they had made a full conversion, which takes millions of dollars, takes a lot of time. It can be a really big decision. So that doesn't mean you can't still use these tools if you don't go full Agile. If I don't want to be sprint planning, I can still use the daily stand-ups. I can still have a post-mortem to talk about with my entire team. What did we do wrong? Why were we all up till midnight the night before it was due? How can we work on this?
Yeah, because unfortunately with my experience, the only part that sponsor companies really do is post-mortem. When something goes wrong, why did it go wrong?
Yeah.
Nothing else is really implemented where you could kind of intercede or see something.
Yeah, and that's the main thing, is just to diffuse those changes and those crazy things that come up. You want to find them over the entire course rather than waiting until the end.
Thank you.
Thank you.